I work with the current generation of AI models that are available to everybody today, I'm filled with wonder at how a few billion numbers and only about 4,000 lines of code can understand natural human language and can reply, can have a conversation better than most people can, and is a domain expert in pretty much everything you want to ask it. It fills me with wonder because it feels like magic, and I think it must have been the same way that people have felt when other technologies came about in the past. I'm reminded of the compass specifically, because the compass is something that's quite simple. It's just a needle with a certain kind of metal that was created long before we understood electromagnetism. In fact, it was about 2000 BC when the compass was created in China. Originally, it was used for divination, things like feng shui and fortune telling. It wasn't until about 1,200 years later that we actually see the compass being used in navigation, initially by the military, and about 100 years after that until it was used by Chinese maritime sailors. Before that, it was common to navigate by reference, typically by the stars, which was a highly skilled thing to learn, and didn't work that well when it was cloudy outside. Fast forward about 100 years, and we see it being used in Western Europe. The countries that adopted it early on would come to build great navies and secure the most lucrative trade routes. Today, while we still see the occasional analog compass on maybe the dashboard of an old van, navigation has evolved quite a bit. Now we use GPS, and getting lost is practically a thing of the past. AI is very similar. AI is currently evolving, and it's going to be something that's even more powerful than we see today. So it's important now that innovative companies get on board and start to build an AI strategy and get ready for the coming AI revolution. What we're going to talk about today is the way that innovative companies can transition into this AI age and reap all the benefits that are available to it. So first, I think we need to start by defining AI. I break artificial intelligence strategies down into 3 basic levels. So the first one is going to be basic research. Basic research is typically the domain of academia, places like the University of Toronto, where Geoffrey Hinton has done a lot of groundbreaking research on deep learning. But there are also a lot of big tech companies that are doing artificial intelligence basic research as well. Meta is a big one, and Google has done some groundbreaking research where Ashish Vashvani and his colleagues developed a seminal paper, Attention is All You Need, which was only published in about 2017. So we're only about 6 years off of that to actually reap some of the huge benefits. The problem with level 1 research, basic research, is that it requires typically PhDs, it requires a lot of computing power, and generally a lot of data. It's not the domain typically of industry. The next level is going to be applied research. So applied research is basically where we take a lot of the findings, the discoveries that we have in industry and academia, and we start to apply it to real-world problems that make our lives better and make money for companies. One example that we always hear about is drug discovery. So drug discovery is a really big one, autonomous driving. There's a lot of really interesting things that have arisen from this. There's also companies like OpenAI that are using basic research to create foundation models. So foundational models are general-purpose, multimodal models that are created to be used outside of the domain that they were created in. That are general-purpose models. Which leads us to level 3, and that's simply using these foundation models. The beauty of these models is that they're affordable. You can sign up for ChatGPT, and get access to GPT-4, this state-of-the-art large language model, for about $20 a month. You need little to no data to actually get started using it, and it doesn't require specialized skills. Now, we'll revisit this a bit later, because if one knows how to use these large language models effectively, you'll get a lot better results out of it. And the important thing to note here is that they're very capable, and while they have a few glitches here and there that we've seen, they're getting more and more capable all the time. Some things that we've all been exposed to in the news, we've heard about GPT-4 passing the bar exam, a lot of medical breakthroughs that we've seen, MRI. There's a game called Diplomacy, which is a very complex strategy game, more complex than Go, which we've heard that artificial intelligence has recently mastered. Diplomacy has been mastered as well by these large language models, where it's virtually unbeatable. And the interesting thing is that we find that by simply telling the truth at all times, these language models are able to win in diplomacy all the time. In healthcare, we've seen it used in a variety of areas. One really interesting study that was recently published showed that people preferred the responses from large language models to those from doctors. They were oftentimes a bit more accurate, and they scored much higher on empathy. A lot of people, when they look at these large language models, will say, well, they're not very creative, they're kind of dull, you're never going to get anything innovative or interesting out of them. And that is really by design. A lot of these models have been crippled, so we don't get, typically they're crippled so we don't see the bias or the toxic content that they've been trained on oftentimes, but also to just give us more friendly responses that we like. There's a book being published here very shortly by Simon Rich and some co-authors that looks at some of this generated AI. Simon Rich is a humorist and a writer for several television comedy shows who has a friend who worked at OpenAI about a year before ChatGPT was released. He met his old friend at a wedding, and he gave him access to this OpenAI that we don't even have access to anymore. Initially, they started doing things like asking to write poetry, like we've seen, but as a humorist, as a comedy writer, Simon Rich started to think, I wonder if this thing could do my job. And so he had it generate a list of potential articles for The Onion, and he was shocked at what it could do. Some of the things they came up with were budget of new Batman movie swells to $200 million as director insists on using real Batman. And some more edgy things like experts warn that the war in Ukraine could become even more boring, something you would never hear it generate today. But the important thing to note here is that the large language models that we have are extremely capable, and the ones that we don't have access to are even more capable than we think. So to use these internally, it's going to really require an organizational and a cultural shift. So what we need to do is embrace AI tools in the organization, and I mean by individuals on our staffs who are using these tools. There is actually a bit of a reticence to admit that we're using artificial intelligence in some of our work. People have a fear that using AI or admitting that you're using AI is a tacit admission that your job can be automated. It's not cheating to use AI, and we need to make that cultural shift, and we need to expect people to use AI as a tool. Just as we don't expect people to do long division anymore, we expect them to use a calculator, we should expect that people are using artificial intelligence to automate some of these more mundane tasks. It's important that we note that AI skills make our employees more valuable. The more skills you know how to use, the more valuable you are to the company. And of course, the big thing is job security. People are afraid that they're going to lose their job to AI, when the truth is they might lose their job to somebody using AI. So they need to get on board and be the person using AI to stay competitive in the post-AI world. Human judgments are strong. There's a lot that humans do better than artificial intelligence. Compassion, human intellect is dynamic and varied. We can take into consideration current and future conditions, and much more. So there's still a lot that humans do. Humans need to focus on what humans are good at and automate things that LLMs are good at. The reality, in fact, is that AI might make more work for you. If we can use AI to be more efficient and get more studies, then we're going to have more onboarding to do, more contracts to sign, more invoices to send out, more data to sift through. So while AI will automate a lot of the work, it's going to create more work for us, but it should be more satisfying work. It should be easier work. It should be less mundane work. So to do this, it's paramount, of course, that we make AI safe. Now, there's a lot to be said here. I'm not going to touch on all of the technical details on it, but there's plenty of documentation. Good machine learning practice are some guidelines that are created by some international standards bodies, and they're promoted by the FDA. So that's a good place for us to start. But there are some easy recommendations that we can all use to de-risk our use of artificial intelligence. Human in the loop is a big one. So it's appropriate to have AI look at the activity that somebody is doing, for example, and make suggestions. But AI shouldn't be acting on those suggestions. For example, AI shouldn't look at a patient and determine whether or not they should be allowed in a trial or whether or not they should be removed from a trial. AI is very good at finding anomalies in large data sets. So it might be appropriate to surface a list of protocol deviations or participants who are at risk of noncompliance or dropping out, and surface that to a research coordinator who can then decide if it's appropriate to act on that. And full disclosure, these slides were actually generated with the latest version of DALL-E, the OpenAI image generator, which has plenty of quirks that need to be viewed as well. For example, this slide here looked like this originally. So I told it to create a human oversight slide. And actually, when I did this, I basically fed the language model my outline. I didn't give it a lot of guidance on what slides to look like, but it just decided that it would do something that looked like oversight, some human judgment, some medical imagery. And it did a pretty good job of doing a high-fidelity image, but it's not good at spelling. So it was important to take that into consideration. Don't give AI the keys to the kingdom. In the same vein, it's important that we verify these systems. So this is more important when we're looking at a level 2 strategy, maybe creating our own models with some of our own data. We need to make sure that it works well in all conditions. We have the right business outcomes, and it's reliable. This is also kind of a complex topic. One thing that we've probably heard about on this is red teaming. Red teaming is something that Google, OpenAI, Meta, all these companies do with their large language models to make sure that they don't have toxic content. This is actually the process that makes GPT-4 a little less interesting than it would have been otherwise. But it's important that we do it so we can control and understand the output of our systems. Finally, I want to talk about transparency. So anytime that we have a participant or any end user working with a system that's backed by artificial intelligence, it's appropriate to notify them that that's the case, especially if there's going to be possible inaccuracies, and especially if there's a potential for risk to the patient. And it's also a good idea to allow them to report any inaccuracies. This can be as easy as a thumbs up, thumbs down. Was this response what you expected? If the stakes are a bit higher, then it might be appropriate to give them a way to add more information and describe what they were trying to do and what went wrong. But these problems are endemic mostly in those level 2 models, those things that we've created ourselves in-house, that a lot of us aren't necessarily doing yet. But I want to reiterate that we can avoid a lot of this by focusing on level 3. As I mentioned, a lot of these level 3 models have already been red teamed. They already work really well. They've already been trained with terabytes and terabytes, petabytes of data. And this also gives us time while we're working with these large language models to allow society to work through some of the issues. There's a lot of conversation around ethical considerations, safety still, and just general societal acceptance. We still don't know what we're going to do with these language models, how they're going to affect society. So there's a lot of conversations in industry and in government to figure out how we're going to do that, how we're going to support that, how we're going to allow it to change society moving forward. But while that's going on, we can start to put it in place. And so here's a couple of examples of how we can actually apply these foundational models. An easy way to get early wins is through operational efficiencies. So here I list a few of the things that we can do. We hear people talking about how difficult it is to get an MSA with a company. There's a lot of questions that come with an RFI, RFP, hundreds of information security questions. Foundation models are really good at reading those questions, looking at our database of previous answers, and synthesizing an accurate, appropriate response. The protocol can potentially be run through a language model to turn it from a loosely structured document into a highly structured document that can be used downstream in other processes, like configuring our products. Project management, we can read SOWs and figure out what needs to happen at different stages of a product. And then finally, the analysis. We can work from that protocol and our CDISC implementation guides to figure out what a good output might look like. And then we need to start talking about the future of these machine learning projects. What do we want to do going forward, basic versus applied? Do we have the data that we need? If not, we may need to update our products to start collecting more appropriate data. And then finally, start looking at partnerships. Who do we have that we can potentially work with who has a lot of data? Can we look at data federation, for example? And then do we need to upskill our current employees? Which brings us to training, which is going to be very important. I mentioned that these large language models are easy to use. Many of you have already used them. But with some simple training around prompt engineering, we can be a lot more effective. And there's a lot of free resources online for this. Coursera, for example, has a very good resource. And then finally, there's a lot of tools available. We should figure out which tools are appropriate for which roles and make those available within our organization. And then finally, facilitate sharing of best practices. A lot of people will have big wins that they can share with others. And then very importantly, we need to figure out how we lay our organizational groundwork. We need to work with our compliance departments to make sure that we're using these models in a correct way, a way that complies with our safety standards. And it also may be appropriate to take some of the open source models and make them available on site, so we're not using a third-party service. And it's important to define what we don't do, what we avoid doing. For example, maybe no unattended code generation, no execution of AI in our products, and no direct-to-AI chat. So hundreds of years ago, the impact of navigation could hardly be understood by the people who were undertaking it at the time. Today, people are just starting to understand the impact that artificial intelligence will have on society. Now, the age of exploration and discovery did not always have good outcomes for all people. And that's true also with artificial intelligence. Fortunately, we are currently involved in those conversations to talk about how AI will affect society and what we can do to mitigate it, so AI has benefits for all. Many people think that AI is out of reach because of the amount of data and the cost required to get started is just too big. That's not true. We can get started on AI today because the era of AI has arrived, and innovative companies are getting started now to figure out how they can benefit from it. And I think that's going to lead to an incredibly exciting future. Thank you.